Welcome to the second webinar in our alternate eligible content Winter-Spring 2017 series. Today's topic is incorporating essentialized examples into lesson and unit planning. Thank you again to everyone for participating with our survey this winter to pick the topics for our Winter-Spring series. If you are new to alternate eligible content, please visit our patent website at www.patent.net. Select the educational initiative, Students with Significant Cognitive Disabilities. Once on this page, you will find on your right a link that will take you to previously recorded webinars, which will give you more information about alternate eligible content, essentialization, and our essentialized examples. If you have questions while viewing this webinar, please feel free to send them to alternateassessment@patent.net. Please reference the date of the webinar, 2/22/2017. Any questions and their answers will be posted as an FAQ with the recorded webinar following this session. So let's get started. So today's focus is really about identifying a process to use the examples for planning instruction. We've spent the past few webinars and even some last spring sharing examples of these essentialized examples for you to use in the classroom. So now today we're going to really dig a little bit deeper into thinking about the application of these essentialized examples. We're going to talk about a process for adapting and modifying the examples with instructional planning. We'll be using examples. As part of the link for today's webinar, there were also handouts available, the PowerPoint today and Handout 1 and Handout 2. Handout 1 and Handout 2 are actual essentialized examples that are appearing on our website, but for your convenience, we wanted you to have them downloaded and in front of you today so you can make some notes on them as we talk and think about essentialized examples within your grade spans and how you can apply them. We'll also talk about and describe how to write meaningful student performance goals for instruction based upon the suggested content targets that you'll find on every example. So let's kind of get together and think about instructional planning. Another name for lesson and unit planning really is instructional planning. So we're going to use this terminology the rest of this presentation to really illustrate what we are describing when we talk about taking these essentialized examples and then using them as a resource for instructional planning. We've said before they are not lesson plans. So there are several components that are part of instructional planning that I am so sure you are aware about. Most importantly, instructional planning always takes into consideration what's going to be the new learning. What will I need to teach explicitly? Once that's decided, it'll be critical to set individual mastery criteria. So how am I going to know as a teacher when I'm teaching this that my students have mastered it? So we're going to talk about how to set that criteria once we start. And we'll also be talking about how do we schedule our teaching time? How can I develop this into a lesson? How much time am I going to need? What are some things I need to think about taking this from the example and then moving it into that teaching experience and learning for my students? What resources am I going to need? What materials will the students need to learn, and what materials will I need to teach this learning? So there are kind of two different perspectives to consider, and we're going to talk about those today. And what do I need to do with modifying curriculums and lessons prior to teaching? So we also want to talk, and we're going to touch on briefly today, how do we develop some corresponding progress monitoring tools to help probe and determine that the students mastered this target. how are they thinking about, how am I thinking about how the student's going to generalize this target across different people, different settings? What is the maintenance? How am I sure the student's going to retain this skill? And how am I going to be measuring that fluency? How accurately the student can demonstrate this skill? So we'll look at some graphs to visually interpret it. We're just touching on it today. As you know, in 2 more webinars, we will really be doing this whole bit about data collection and data decision making, and we'll spend really a lot more time on this topic. So then we're also going to touch very briefly on how do I train support staff to help in the classroom. So that's going to be our instructional planning piece. So our essentialized examples, as you know, and this little graphic on here talks to a lot of the pieces we've discussed when we think about essentialized examples and how they incorporate the alternate eligible content and our intent statements. So we're going to think about using these examples to support the planning. So they're really a guide to help create the different targets. They help you think about how to make further content modifications if you have to reduce the complexity even further. How am I going to group students to do some of this instruction? So as you know, on the essentialized examples, we give you 3 buckets of consideration. And we also can use these examples to help train others and help them understand the content. And also to think about preparation for our students as they look at accountability testing each year. So what we do know, and we've told you this before, we're going to just spend just a brief few seconds on this. Essentialized examples are not lesson plans, unit plans, or instruction. They just give us some examples. They're not cookie cutter examples to be taught. We want you to be able to take them and use them in ways that are really going to be beneficial with content that's meaningful and application that's meaningful for your students. They're not IEP goals. We know we spent our time in last month looking at how to make IEP goals from alternate eligible content and using the essentialized examples, thinking about that. They're not complete with all the pieces of instruction that you'll need. And they're not assessment items. So they do give you some samples of probes or way to determine if the student has mastered the content. So I want you to pull out your handout 1, which is our ELA example. It's a 3rd grade literature piece of content identifying characters and what they do during events in a story. So this uses a piece of text called The Attack of the Leftovers. And just as a reminder, and I'm sure you've seen this before, our alternate eligible content section is located at the top left of the example on the front page. And then we have our intent statement, which is a broader conceptual learning of what that alternate eligible content wants students to know and be able to do. And if you remember, that intent statement really helps us think about how to reduce that complexity even further, but still stay lined into that alternate eligible content. And then we have the 3 buckets. We have our most complex section, and we're going to kind of dissect those today and look at how each of those pieces can be incorporated or considered during instructional planning. We have our kind of that mid-complex complexity of content level, and we have our least content complexity level, where we give you an example, knowing that you may even need to take that back further. But it gives you a starting spot. So keep that example in front of you, and we're going to walk through thinking about how to use these pieces, including the graphics, text, tables, symbols, all of that that's incorporated on the example for planning instruction. So if you have some Post-it notes with you today, or handy, or a way to kind of jot some notes down, there's really 5 things we want you to think about, or 5 steps when we think about planning instruction using our essentialized examples. So step one is really at the very beginning, before you start your lesson. You know the content you're going to be teaching. You've become familiar with that alternate eligible content. And so you want to get started, but you really need to first define what that student will need to do to demonstrate mastery. So how am I going to know when the student has shown me that they can demonstrate that they know and can do what this content's asking? So it really involves stating some conditions. And we've talked about that in relation to IEPs, but this is really in relation to instruction. So it could be like an objective. It could be one of those smaller pieces that is working towards mastery of an IEP goal and objective. But even when you teach, you need to know, when have we reached that goal? Just like when you're running a race, where's that finish line? And that's what our mastery criteria is really going to be, our finish line. And it's really going to guide you with your instruction. So you can say, hey, the students got it, or you know what, I need to reteach it, or I need to think of a different way to do it, or they've got it, but they're not generalizing it. So I'm going to have to maybe think of a different way to present it to get them to that place. You know, you can use them. They can be part of IEP goals. So it's not saying you can't use it as an IEP goal, but whether you're teaching or whether you're measuring towards those year-long targets, you really need to always make sure that you're building in a measurable kind of target. It doesn't have to look as formal, and we'll talk about that, but it doesn't have to look as formal as our IEP goals and objectives. And I'll give you some ideas of maybe how you can use your examples, your essentialized examples, and kind of jot down some information on there. Review your intent statement as you're modifying the content or reducing it further to make sure that you're still staying aligned. So we're going to take a look at this ELA example, and we're going to first look at content target. So we have it at our most complex level, our mid, and our least. So our next slide looks at the alternate eligible content, which is identify characters and what they're doing, what they do during events in the story. Our intent statement is to identify, find name characters, and describe what they did in the story. So at the most complex level, we give you a content target to name the characters in the story and describe 2 things that each one said or did. But we don't have specific student mastery criteria. How are you going to know the student's done that? How many times? You know, just doing it once could be just, you know, they might have had a good day, a lucky moment, or the story was so familiar to them that they were able to pull it together. So we often have to look at mastery being over a couple different probes or a couple different kind of ways that we're checking in with the student. Mid-complex, we're going to reduce the text even further and give some pictures of characters so the student can identify the character whose actions are being described. So you see, it's being reduced even further, and so it still doesn't have specific student mastery criteria. How am I going to know what's my measure that the student is able to do that? And at the least complex level, we're going to have the text describe the behavior, picture cues of 2 characters, and then we're going to identify the character whose actions being described. So we've reduced that even further. So if we wanted to put some mastery criteria, some really student-specific ways that I'm going to know the student has completed this, I could do something where I'm going to have the student be able to do that 100% in 3 consecutive probes. I would not need to write it out formally. We did for this webinar today, but you could just as easily, next to that content target on your essentialized example, jot in that I want them to do it 100% in 3 consecutive check-ins with them. Or 3 different stories, and they do it 100%. Then I know they've got it and I can move on. We know research shows us that the 3 consecutive probes is a good measure of gaining that knowledge. So that's something you want to think about, and use your example to help you do that. We're not asking you to do extra work to write out extra goals. You could just print out, if it's something in their IEP and you specifically are connecting it, you could just print that out and keep track of it on there. So here's some things that make this the most complex. We're going to have the student doing some independent reading probably, or we're going to be reading it to them, but we're going to be using mostly just the words in the text. They're going to have to ID or find the 2 characters and the actions of each, and we can use picture supports as needed. At the mid-complex level, and we've already got that for you in that essentialized example, but again, you might want to jot next to it that you want the student, and in this case, we're looking for 100% in 3 consecutive check-ins with the student. And we're going to know that by they've heard it, read it. They only have to identify 1 character from a selection of 2, and then have the actions of the character are going to be described, and the vocabulary is going to be reduced. At the least complex level, again, we talked about that we're going to give them most of the information, but they're going to be able to connect the character to the action, but we're going to give all of that to them. And again, we're going to ask that for 100% correct in 3 check-ins, and it could be 3 different stories. It could be, we would suggest you at least change the story at least once, if not for all 3 times. And we're going to have the student be listening to the text. That's going to be greatly reduced. So there's not going to be a lot of cognitive demand, and we're going to, in regard to the amount of text the student has to hold on to, and then we're going to have them select a character from 2 picks, and we're going to describe the actions, and then the student is then going to be, through the pictures or the manipulatives, be able to demonstrate for us their knowledge. Again, write it right on that essentialized example. You can jot it in there to help you. You can make little places, put the kids' different names on there, put sticky notes on it, and just, to help you remember what you're looking for that's going to demonstrate mastery. Most important as your first step. Second step is then determine, how often am I going to teach this? How long am I going to teach this during the day or week? And kind of plan that out. You're going to, if you know how long you're going to be teaching and how often, it helps you to think about the amount of materials you're going to need, the variety of materials you might need, particularly if you're in your criteria for the student to demonstrate success. You want to do it over 3 different stories. So you're going to have to be able to, okay, I'm going to maybe use the story that's on the essentialized example, but I'm going to need maybe a couple more, and kind of give you some time to pull that together, or use one of your support staff to help you find some of those materials, so you can assign them appropriately. It also helps you think about how much you might need to train the support staff in regard to what your students need to know and be able to do. So, additional guidelines. Thinking about, well, if I have to determine how often I'm going to teach it or how long I'm going to teach, especially if it's new information, I may need to teach it longer. But the first thing you need to think about is what's reasonable for the student's age and ability level. If you're not sure, check with other same grade general ed teachers. What are their average student's duration requirements? How long can they teach something? What's reasonable? If you're not sure, always start at a lesser length of time and then increase it. Sometimes, depending on the student's attention, their ability to attend to instruction, so you might need shorter, more frequent sessions, so that you can really engage the student with that instruction. And then based upon the data of what you know, the student in their learning history, how many times do they need to contact the learning opportunities to master it? We also need to think about, depending what they know, what background knowledge are they bringing, how much do I need to pre-teach, what have they actually, what do they already know about the content? And I know one of our teachers in a previous session, when she talked about doing some of the addition and subtraction, that was part of the content she was working on the essentialized example. She talked about that the students knew a lot, and so it was a great building block when she looked at that repeated addition as that skill at the most complex level. So it was really building on that. So it didn't take as long for the students to learn it because there was a whole lot there. Whereas when she moved into the multiplication, they had some building blocks, but there needed to be some more time that had to be built into what she was going to do with that essentialized example. So it's really important to take that data into consideration. And also ensure that your support staff have some fluid understanding of what's to be done, because they're going to be supporting you. They should hopefully have access to the essentialized examples, which also give them some background knowledge on what it is that students need to know and do with that content. So here's an example of a schedule for this, identifying characters and what they do during events in a story. So it could be, here's a couple different examples. It could be one 30-minute session with 2 to 3 short readings per session, checking in with the students with their understanding of that content and the ability with that new learning. Or maybe you need 2 15-minute sessions a day, one real short reading with each session, instead of doing it all at once. So you can break it down based upon your students and based upon the realities of your classroom. So after you've got your criteria established, your teaching schedule, thinking about when you're going to teach it, how long you're going to teach it, then you really need to think about what materials do I need to bring to the table for the student to help them with their understanding of this content. So look at that example. We do have some samples in there. Review and practice how you're going to teach the content if you have that time available. Review some curriculums or some other resources you might have that can support this learning. You know, perhaps if you're using another resource in your classroom that could be relevant for that piece of content that you selected, and so you can pull stories or examples from there, or incorporate it in maybe lesson flow that you're already providing. And based on your teaching schedule, think about how you're going to structure those teaching materials needed across the next few weeks. So maybe introduce 1 story or 2 stories the first week and bring in another story that you're going to be checking in with the student to look for their achievement with the criteria you've set up. You know, if you need to include some teaching materials for skills that you might need to be teaching prior, like being able to identify characters in a story, because this particular content is looking for the connection between the characters and events, you may need to do some continued practice on identifying the different characters in a story. Could be part of that instructional design as well. And we've talked about that across the webinars, thinking about building that into your instruction. And thinking about if you're going to pair activities, having students work together, what materials are you going to need to make sure that comes off smoothly and effectively for all the students involved. You want to prep based on your teaching schedule or using your support staff to help with the preparation based on your teaching schedule and when you're going to need materials. And if you do that ahead of time, it saves a lot on downtime for students as you're trying to gather things together. It helps be purposeful, so that all of your time is dedicated to the student's instruction, really gives them the most bang for your buck during that time frame that you have to teach. And it helps with improving that transition, where we know a lot of times if you're going to have some problem behavior or behavior outbursts erupt, it's going to be during those transitions. And I can relate to that so personally, knowing that from experience in the classroom, that if things were going to happen, it was when we were trying to scramble to get things together for that next thing that we were going to teach, and that's when students, we would often have to kind of run interference or put some things in place to intercede with behavior. So you want that improvement across teaching environments and across content by being as prepared as you possibly can, and using these resources to help with that. And it also helps with, if you can get your support staff involved to the extent that you have some support staff in your classroom with gathering materials that you'll need for teaching, and materials that the students are going to need to demonstrate understanding and to engage in this instruction. So we're going to look at this example again because we're going to be then thinking about materials and things that could be used. You can use what's in these resources. Everything's available in that Word or PDF. So in PDF you can cut and you can clip it, or in Word you can actually manipulate it and put different pictures in that might be more relevant and familiar for your students, or change the example completely and just use this as like a template to kind of put some of your own stories in there. So let's look at an example of some teaching materials with this: identify characters and what they do during events in the story. So here's our mastery criteria. Again, this is nothing that's set for you to fill in. We have it here for you to think about, and you can be jotting this information right on your example, on your Essentialized example. If you've printed it out, you could be jotting in, like I said, the mastery criteria next to a content target. You can cross out words in the content target and put in the ones that make more sense for your students. But then thinking about, in this particular one, if we chose that we had already decided, we know what our criteria is, we know we're going to be teaching it in the classroom for 30 minutes a day. We're going to do one session, but we're going to do short readings, one short reading per the session with the probe. I'm going to engage my students, and these are some of the ways that I'm going to do it. I'm going to first, here's some of the materials I'm going to use. I'm going to have prepared for over the next few weeks 5 different readings within that third grade band. So I'm going to look at third grade reading level. Here's some examples. The one we have for you that's available is that Attack of the Leftovers. ReadWorks has many, many more. Here's some other ideas. Sheila Ray the Brave. Mr. George Baker, Amber Brown is Not a Crayon, Dr. DeSoto. You can go, remember we shared all those resources of things that are already available. Some are already reduced in complexity across all those ELA resources in previous webinars. So if you want to go back and check those to just give you an idea of some that you can pull down, or you can ask your support staff to pull down, so you have the resources ready to go. They can pull them down, print them out, and your students could have them ready to go. And then we're thinking about some different activities that I'm going to do, some paired activities. We're going to have some short phrases where the student selects characters and what the characters are doing. We're going to have them define the character. We're going to do lots of practice around the characters. We're going to probably have available photocopy pictures of the characters and actions from the reading. As you can see, we have some available on that centralized example, but that doesn't mean you can't pull in your own and pull in ones that go with the stories that the students would be reading from the selected part of the reading. Remember, you don't have to do the whole story, but certain parts to be able to demonstrate it. You can read the whole story, but then just go back and focus on the part that's really going to make the most sense to help your students achieve and demonstrate that they can identify a character and what they're doing in the story. I'm going to give you a quick second before I move on. Just take a deep breath. Think about some of the things we talked about. You're probably in your head, you're going, yeah, I already do a lot of that. And we're just kind of putting it into a format that you can think about it in relation to these essentialized examples. So I'm going to give you a minute to kind of take a deep breath and kind of digest some of this before we move on. Think about some things you've done in the classroom recently around literature or informational text. What would you do differently? What are you doing the same that really maybe you can add to or enhance, or just keep going the way you're going? The next step is really thinking about supports. We've thought about our criteria. We've established when we're going to teach it, how often we're going to teach it. We know what it's going to look like when the student achieves it. We've pulled together materials that we know the student's going to need to access this content, whether it's the stories, the pictures of the characters, ways that I'm going to, as the teacher, use to engage the student. So when we talk about supports now, I want you to shift gears. We were just looking through the lens of the student. I want you to look through your lens, the lens of the teacher. So what is it that you're going to need that's going to help the student successfully demonstrate the learning? So as you're teaching this, particularly when it's new instruction, what are you going to need? So examples. You might need manipulatives. You may need some visuals, objects. If you're doing math, you might need number lines. You might need giant number lines. You might need the story ready to go up on your smart board. You might need color coding, memory joggers, maybe some vocabulary cards that you're going to use with the students. So thinking about some of the things you're going to need as you're delivering the instruction to this small group or large group or with an individual student. And different kids may need different things. So every student should get what they need. So thinking about that from your perspective, what are you going to need to deliver this instruction? So again, we know we're going to be doing this. We selected for this example 1 30-minute session. We're going to do 1 short reading per session with probes. So I may need to teach this photocopy pictures of the characters and potential actions. We know the students have theirs because they're going to have something in front of them, something that's going to help engage them. But I'm going to need something as I'm teaching. So I'm going to need it for those selected parts. I may need some objects to teach some unfamiliar actions. I may need to have in my head some scripted acting outs that I'm going to do to demonstrate some actions, but I'm going to need to have that kind of organized before I get started, so I know that's going to be part of my lesson. I'm going to need to maybe include some extra picks and actions as distractors, things that aren't related to the story, so that when I want to establish my mastery criteria, so I know that the student knows what it is, that they truly are selecting the correct answer. And I'm not just always giving them what is the correct answer. So that's going to be important to have. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit today about establishing some data collection systems. So when we think about data collection, and we think about, we started this whole session with, how am I going to know what the student knows at the end of teaching? How am I'm going to set some criteria, but then it's important that we collect that and collect it along the way to help monitor progress, not just while we're doing instruction, but also to report it out. So, and also to guide, where do I go next? What piece of content am I going to collect? You remember, if you were with us last month, we looked at that whole decision-making kind of flow chart, so that I know when I need to go back and reteach, and when I need to know to move on, and when I need to know to move up, move over to the next piece of content, pull in more. So all of these pieces go very clearly together with instruction. So I've established how often I'm going to teach it. I've established how I'm going to, what materials I'm going to use, what I'm going to need to deliver that instruction, and now I need to figure out a way that I'm going to collect it. And we're going to have much more for you in the way of handouts and ideas how to collect it in 2 webinars in April. So we want you to have some examples if you want to start moving in that direction, and then we'll go dig real deep in April with you. But thinking about data collection, we have to use it to determine, is the student making progress or are they not? We can't wait till it's quarterly report time and say, well, not doing it, or NA, we haven't touched it. We need to be fully aware in the classroom as teachers, and I'm talking from example from my own perspective. It was really important that I knew what teachers, what my students were doing, so I could make daily, weekly decisions, but that really impacted what was going to be reported out quarterly, and then what was reported out when I met with the parents at the IEP. And I wanted to be sure as I could be in the clarity of that report out. And it was exciting to see how kids made progress. The more I collected the data, the more I could see it, it really made me feel like I was doing something in the classroom. Because some days, you know, you really feel like you're working really hard, and the students don't seem to be making the progress that you really want them to make, but really they are. And sometimes you have to look at it over time to see that progress happening, and to make those decisions about what's going on with the instruction and how you're delivering it, so that you can also think about, why isn't the student making progress? Maybe they've been absent a lot, and many of our students, you know, that's a reality because of doctor's appointments or different things, barriers physically that come into play. And that's just a reality. Or how many times am I giving them opportunities to learn? Maybe I need to go back and think about my teaching schedule. You know, if they're not getting it, can I work on maybe more frequently getting it? Because I see them one time and then I don't get back to them till the following week with that content, and they seem to have lost it. So maybe I need to just be more frequent with the amount of time that I'm teaching, so that they retain that information. You know, what mistakes are they making? You know, that helps me think about the way I'm teaching it, and the way I could maybe change the way I'm teaching to help them make progress. So a lot of things can come when you collect this data. It was like such an aha moment for me as a classroom teacher that if there was one thing I could share across the state with folks, it's that the more you collect and the more you reflect on what students are learning. And sometimes I didn't reflect on it right in the moment because sometimes I had so much going on. I collected it, but then maybe at the end of the day I had like 5-10 minutes to look at it and I was like, wow, that really made me think and made me think about how I was going to maybe approach things in the future. And it also, yeah, like I said before, it helps us report this information out very accurately to our IEP team members and to look at how our students are learning across content. So if we go back to our ELA example in 3rd grade and we think about this content and we look at, we build in some probes here for you at the end of each piece of content in different ways. So it's something to think about. We're not saying you have to use this exactly, but it's a sample, it's an example to say, after I've taught this, this might be a way that would show me that the student has learned what it is that I've asked them based on that content target. However, what we don't have is that mastery criteria. So you need to make sure that's plugged in, and that's going to really drive what these probes or check-ins are going to look like. So here's that probe at the mid-complex and least complex. So here's our, back to what we said was going to be kind of what we were thinking about, using that content target with a measurable criteria with it. And again, you could have this written on your essentialized example, and you could also have a kind of formal or informal way that you're collecting some of that data, whether it's right on your essentialized example or whether you want to make a quick little form. And we have some things you might want to collect on there. You want to make sure the students on there, a place to keep track of the date of when when you collected the data, because that could have a lot of impact depending again on some of that criteria we shared last slide, whether they're absent, maybe they're just having a bad day. I mean, we all have bad days, and our students included. So you need to make sure you have a way to collect some information about that. And a way to collect what target you're working on, what's the story, because maybe you can start seeing a pattern across different stories. Just simply correct or incorrect for the character, correct or incorrect for what the character did, and a notes section, so you can make some information that you can collect. So like they're having a really bad day, or they just didn't understand this character at all, just they couldn't relate to it. So we did one real quick, and it was real easy, just a sample, just a sample. So here are the probes I pointed out before. So at the most complex level, it's just a question. We are looking probably for a verbal, or we could have pictures or objects in front of the student, but they're really basing their information on processing the text. At the mid-complex level, we're using a lot of pictures, visuals, manipulative supports, and we're going to give them the event, and they really have to kind of connect to the character, and then we also are trying to probe that in 2 different ways. And at the least complex level, we're going to give a prompt with the text and then ask them that question with the event, and then they have to select the character. So you can see how that is, again, reduced in complexity. Again, samples. Use what works for your students. Use stories that work for your students. Use characters that work for your students. But you can see there is you can make those probes really student-specific, related to the way that they take information in and the way that they show information. So pulling it all together, just a quick little summary with an instructional planning guide. Again, our goal is not to have you filling in forms. So it's just a framework and just another way to look at it, thinking about what is it we want the student to know and how well do we want them to know it, that number one. Number two, how often am I going to teach it? How long am I going to teach it? What does the student need? Number three, they need all these different stories. They need some picture objects. They need some activities. What do I need to help them learn this information and as I deliver it? And how am I going to collect data? And what am I collecting information on? So that I can report out and have a really good example and thinking about this content and what my students know and can do. So I can make some decisions. So are you with me? We're going to apply all of this, not in the as detailed as we did with the ELA, but just show you what it could look like at math at the secondary level. So our math example is a piece of 8th grade content, and it's answer a question using data from a two-way table. And here's the essentialized example. I'm going to ask you to pull out handout number 2, and you should have that as part of your handouts for this webinar. And you'll see your alternate eligible content, your intent statement. We have the 3 buckets, most complex, mid-complex, and then with graphics, it often takes up a little more space. Should have a page that has the least complex. And of course, graphics, text, tables, symbols to help support this piece of content. Again, one example, one sample. Thinking about it through this lens of what is it that I want my students to know and how well do I want them to know it, to say that they can know and do it. What am I thinking about how long and how often it's going to take me to teach it? So I want to think about that and set that up ahead of time. What materials will my students need to participate in that new learning, in that instruction, and in that practice? And what am I going to need to teach that? What kind of resources am I going to need to make sure I have ready to go? And how am I going to collect data about what the students, what I've set up as their criteria, so I can report out on it and make decisions about what they're learning and how I can better teach it. So here we are using data in a two-way table to answer questions. Our most complex content target is when shown a two-way table, the student will use data to answer the questions. At the mid-complex level, that content target looks pretty similar, but your criteria is going to be looking a little bit different. We're going to be using at the most complex level a lot of digits and words, but we're going to be using pictures and a lot of, even though we're using pairs, we're going to be using a lot of quantitative amounts. And by the time we get to the least complex level, it's going to be a very simplified two-way table to use data to answer questions. So instructionally, I'm going to be using a lot of pictures, quantitative amounts, reduced complexity in the amounts. So you understand that, as we've talked about that a lot in past webinars. So looking at it, setting up the mastery criteria, again, we have it written out formally, but if you're thinking in your head and you have your essentialized example out, just jot in for each student what's going to be mastery for that student. In this particular student, we're looking at 100% correct and 3 consecutive probes or check-ins. And the student's going to be using some independent interpretation of that, using digits and words, and interpreting the table as pretty much on their own. That's what we're going to see that at the most complex level. At the mid-complex level, again, we're going to be using a lot more supports in there. Again, jot down your mastery criteria on your form. You don't have to write out a formal mastery criteria statement and fill in a blank somewhere. We want you to just, in the flow of your teaching, being able to maybe jot in that information. We give you those sample sample content targets. So please use those as they best meet the needs of your students. And in this one, words are going to be paired with pictures and manipulatives. We're going to use numerical amounts. And a lot of times the complexity of amounts can be reduced. They don't have to be, but they can. And at the least complex level, we're going to use a very simplified table. Again, you can jot in what that criteria is going to look like for that student. Cross out words in that content target on there. Put in what makes sense for your kids, just so you have it in your head and you have a fixed target of what you know will show you that your student knows and can do this content. And again, this is what it looks like as we're reducing in complexity. We're only using visuals and manipulatives. We're modeling and support are provided to help guide the student when answering. So again, you can jot a lot of this down on your essentialized example chart, or if you have another way to do it, or put sticky notes on, or however, or maybe you have a great photographic memory that you can just put it in your head and you've got it. And that's all that we can ask of teachers, is just to make sure that you're considering that you have a target with some specific criteria. It's going to help guide you to know the students learned it, because that's when you can make that decision. I'm moving on, I'm moving over, or I'm just have to move up. So those are things to think about. So we think about the teaching schedule. So now you know what it's going to look like when your student's made mastery and has achieved the content. Excuse me. So now you have to think about how often, how frequently I want to plan to teach this. So here's just some suggestions, a couple different ways to think about it. You may have other ways that you can think about it. Maybe you're going to do it in one 30-minute session a day. Maybe I'm going to do 15, 20 minutes of direct instruction because it's new content. A lot of times, some of this math may be really new to students, so you're going to have to spend maybe more extra time directly teaching with guided practice, lots of feedback, lots of variety, in this case maybe lots of variety of tables to get the students to demonstrate mastery. Maybe your students, you need to break that into two 15-minute sessions, intensive instructions in specific areas, like maybe, for example, they might need specific instruction in how to read columns and rows of a table. You might need to really practice that, and that's okay. Or you may have a session that's just identifying what the content is in the table, and that's okay. But you have to be planful and think about what that teaching schedule is going to look like over a week, 2 weeks, or even a day. It depends on your students and how much background knowledge and how quickly they can pick it up. So all of that comes into play in your thinking about your teaching schedule with this content. So looking again at this math example, we're going to look at graphics and text tables and symbols that are provided, or ways that you can use maybe some of these blank grids to put in what is familiar and would be relevant for your students. So we're going to think about teaching materials. So again, here's your content is in there, thinking about what my mastery criteria is, how I'm going to teach it, what materials are the students going to be needing, because I'm going to be doing some specific instruction. So in our March webinar, we're going to talk about what that can look like. So stay tuned. But in the meantime, you may need to pull together 3 tables. So maybe I'm going to use the table that's in that essentialized example. That's okay. You can use that. Or you can manipulate it and put whatever you want in there. Use whatever content, pictures, visuals you want. Maybe you just want to get the blank grid and you already have some manipulatives in your classroom that you want to use. I would go for it. Or print out the blank grid, and use it explicitly when you're teaching columns and rows, for example. So there's lots of different ways to use that essentialized example that can help support you with this instruction. So you're going to have some paired activities. Maybe the students are working in think, pair, share. Maybe they're going to construct a table. You're going to collect some data in the classroom. Lots of different ways that this particular example can be kind of fleshed out into instruction. You're going to use maybe content that's appropriate for the students. We would caution you, make sure it's age appropriate. So what you're using, something an 8th grader would be using. Or if you're using a 4th grade example, 4th grade essentialized example, make sure it's what 4th graders would typically be looking at in their examples. And you can use blank grids. Establish some supports for you as the teacher. So we already know the criteria is, we know how often, how frequently we're going to be teaching this. So I may need some photocopies or pictures or objects because I'm going to be delivering that and kind of getting the students engaged and manipulating things on their tables. I may need some templates. I may need to blow a template up. I need to have one for my smartboard. So you want to make sure you have all that prepared ahead of time. You may want to think about think, pair, share structures so the students are working together in groups and reporting out so that you can maximize engagement. You may want to think about manipulatives. If you're fortunate enough that you have extra sets of hands, maybe you have students that come down from other classrooms to support the students in your self-contained classroom. If you're in a general ed classroom and the students included, what are some ways to pair up kids with those think, pair, share structures. You may need some wiki sticks to help define the graph. So raise it up so the student can feel it and know what the graph is. So those are all things that go into thinking about the supports for this lesson and using this essentialized example. So when we think about probes, and like we did with the ELA, we're going to go back and look at what maybe the sample has provided that might give us some ideas of how to structure that, and that's included in all the essentialized examples. So here's our back to thinking about what our criteria is, how we're going to know that students know and can do the content. So we think about what would we need on this particular piece of data collection form. We're going to need a title, correct or incorrect. We don't need anything too specific. You may want to put down who actually was checking in with the student, collecting the data, and the notes section to describe any information, whether it's students having a bad day or they keep making the same error. So this is just a sample of what that could look like. Again, a sample, and we'll go in more depth on that in April. So please make sure you sign up and join us, and we'll have lots of samples for you to print out and take with you as well. So in math, here's some sample probes across the different levels that were on our essentialized example. And then we had a data chart that the student was using and answering the questions in relation to that. They could be written questions, they could be verbally given questions, depending on how your students take information in and how they show what they know. At the mid-complexity level, again, we had a data chart. They could be manipulatives on your data, two-way data chart. They could be pictures. Any way that you can represent that the students can best take the information in and show what they know. But again, this would get to what that alternate eligible content was asking students to know and be able to do. And at the least complex level, notice the table is going to be much less complex. We're going to make sure the students understand all the symbols on the table as we would for every chart, but specifically probing that out, and then find and tell one that gave more. So they're really looking for the larger set. We're not asking them to count. So we give you some ideas that you want to get away from just having them match. But again, samples, ideas for you to think about what it looks like when students can show you what they know. So that was the whirlwind tour of applying our essentialized examples to considerations for lesson planning. We hope you stay tuned with us for our series. Upcoming webinars in March, we'll have the one on alternate eligible content and really flush out that effective instructional delivery. So I have all my materials, I have my criteria, how I'm going to collect the data. Now, what does that look like as I'm delivering instruction? We're going to give you some tips, some ideas, and some samples that we hope can help you. We'll also take a look in April, like I said, digging deeper on that data collection and decision making. We are anticipating having some good handouts for you, some samples for data collection. And then in May, we're going to circle back around and take a look at alternate eligible content and give you some more essentialized examples for writing. We gave you one in our writing webinar, but we should have that flushed out for you in more depth in writing and science in May. So that'll kind of situate you as you think about to end the school year and think about starting up in that 17-18 school year. I want to thank you for taking part today. If you aren't part of our listserv, volunteer sign up, please make sure you sign up on our patent website under the Educational Initiative Students with Significant Cognitive Disabilities. If you have any specific questions, you can contact myself, Linda Lupp, our statewide Special Ed Assessment Coordinator, or Audrey Capel. Thank you very much. Have a good day. If you would like to receive a certificate of completion for attending today's webinar, please record this code and answer the questions found at the SurveyMonkey link, which is with the link for this webinar.